Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I'm James. I'm with Roy. We've kind of been on a little hiatus. We've had episodes, but Roy and I haven't been together. So it's great for us to be together again.
I know, man. I'm doing well. I've missed it, but you've done such a great job. I've loved the interviews that you've done with some of our other panelists for the Church and Trauma Summit. And so I've actually walked away with some really cool takeaways and understandings myself. So you've done a great job with that. So
thanks. It's been fun. Yeah, this episode and really for the rest of this summer, we're going to be talking about the Church and Trauma Summit that's coming up here in September. We've mentioned it on every episode with the panelists that we have. But again, Church and Trauma Summit, September 17th from 10 to 2 here in Lincoln at City Impact. City Impact is partnering with us and hosting the event at their space. You can register at chne.org/summit, and that'll be in the show notes as well. And so we're just going to start by reminding you or telling you, if you haven't listened to the podcasts that we've been doing this summer, what is the summit? Why do we have it? What are we hoping to accomplish? And then Roy and I are going to get into what we think is some pretty significant issues around church and trauma. And maybe we'll have one episode on this, 2, 3, 4. We were just talking about that before the episode. We'll see how far we get. It'll be a wide-ranging conversation. And probably like most of our conversations, Roy, not super linear, but because actually when you think about it, it makes sense because trauma is complex and
it is
chaotic, right? It's not like, just like discipleship. We don't just say, well, I progressed from this point to this point and now I'm here. No, sometimes it's 3 steps forward, 4 steps back, 1 forward, 2 back, and could be, life is not always perfectly linear and chronological. So let's first talk about just like, what is the Church and Trauma Summit? I mean, really simply, it's a gathering. It's a first step for the local church to help the local church move towards God's heart for the vulnerable. Really basic. It's not a one-off event. It's something we're going to do annually. But it's a part of a bigger focus, a bigger initiative for us to really unite the church around 2 things. How can we be responsive to the trauma we see in our communities with people who are struggling? But then what happens before that is, how can churches become healthy to address the trauma, the impact of pain and suffering in our own lives, but in our congregations?
Right.
And as an organization that specializes in trauma, even though we may not be perfect experts, we want to do the best we can to help unite the church around those two things. So, Roy, when you think about the summit and kind of our goals and what we hope to accomplish, what's on your heart that way?
Right. Well, I remember when you and I just really sat down and we talked about, strategy, and we were having a little bit of a visioning session. And this really was birthed out of that. And I think there's multiple factors, at least as I process this, there's multiple factors that have really driven this initiative for us. Part of that is the current foster and adoptive families that we currently serve and have gone through Christian Heritage, and even those that are not a part of Christian Heritage, where we hear and see churches asking foster families to leave because they don't feel equipped to care for the needs of the current foster families or the adoptive families in that. So we hear that, and that is heartbreaking, by the way, that churches, don't feel equipped to deal with some of the behaviors, but then it isolates even further for that adoptive foster family the needs and connection and community they need. And so we've talked a lot about trauma. The thing that counters trauma is connection.
Yep.
And so if we have, families and churches who don't even feel connected to their own church, that is a major problem for any foster care agency, but I think especially the families that we serve here. So that's one factor.
Yeah.
I think the other large factor of that, and we see this, right? We all attend churches, our kids attend churches. I see the church struggling to meet heightened behaviors with younger, children's ministry, youth leaders struggling with meeting Gen Z and this generation who's really struggling with anxiety and depression, higher suicide rates, self-harm. So when you start looking at all the data, and then you look at, we've talked about this probably a lot, share it again, is even before the pandemic, the CDC was reporting only 4 out of 10 kids in the US were flourishing. 4 out of 10 before the pandemic. So we do have a mental health epidemic and crisis. And, so part of that for us is, well, this is kind of our world a little bit as Christian Heritage. We understand trauma. We train our families on understanding trauma. We ourselves are, striving to learn more about that. And we still have a lot to learn. So don't think we've arrived in this space. But as we think about the families we serve, the families that we want to continue to recruit to become foster families or be part of our Families Together program to, provide preventative hosting to keep kids out of foster care. Well, if the church is in somewhat of I would say a silent crisis of knowing how to deal with trauma, we got to start tackling that. We got to start tackling that. And so you and I have talked a lot about this as, the concept is you cannot give what you do not have. We cannot help children flourish if we ourselves are not flourishing. Christian Heritage, if we're not flourishing, we are at the end of the day not going to serve children or our foster families or anyone well. If the church is not flourishing, it's not going to be serving, their constituency, their congregation, those who are currently sitting in their pews and those currently outside of their pews who they long to attract. And so I think as we have wrestled with that, we need to start talking about trauma. And we just feel like there's a massive void, both locally and nationally, around this topic. And we're like, well, do we just ignore it? It's almost like we see a car wreck. We see it, we're the first ones on the scene. We can't just drive by. And so we are tackling it head on, and it's going to be probably messy and we have a lot to learn, but we feel like it's a conversation that is desperately needed right now. And we're championing that cause. We want to be a catalyst for the right conversations, not the wrong conversations, but definitely the right conversations around trauma and how does our faith inform our responses towards where our culture, where our families are at. So that's the heartbeat behind the summit.
I think for a minister, whether you're a lead pastor, outreach minister, children's minister, whatever you are, I think you could feel like church is not a safe place to discuss these issues because you might not even know where your congregation sits on the issue of trauma or vulnerable people or how to engage. And so what we want to do is provide that. That's how I'm thinking about it, is we provide an environment, a space, an atmosphere to discuss this. We've done episodes on felt safety and the importance of that for us. And I think we want to provide that for churches, the churches we partner with, the churches who don't partner with us. Okay, how do we talk about this issue? It has to be done in a safe environment. And here's an environment where we are open and willing to discuss really hard things, really uncomfortable things. And as for those of you listen and you've heard the other podcast, we've talked about some pretty uncomfortable stuff, even in terms of where the church falls short and how we got to catch up to this conversation. And so think about it from that angle too, is this is a safe place to talk about really difficult things and where we're all in process. And Roy, you just mentioned it, we've been teaching and talking about trauma for 40 plus years here at Christian Heritage, but we haven't got it all figured out. We haven't graduated to the point where we're yep, we know everything about it. No, we're still learning too. And so the Church and Trauma Summit just provides that context for church leaders, or really anyone who leads spiritually. You don't hear oh, I have to be a church leader to come. No, come. You're welcome to come. If you want to be there, you probably have an interest in helping people in your church and in your community. And so this is for people who want that safe place to talk about a really difficult, complex, and probably what I would call a polarizing topic.
Well, right. And so, again, when we talk about these things, what we don't have, James, is a shared language.
Exactly.
That we can talk about this together, because there's a lot of confusion inside and outside of the church about mental health and, what is a trauma-informed practice versus in a trauma responsive practice. I mean, these are relatively new concepts to the church. And so how do we respond well to that? And there are things, just as, the church might be, I think of the church minister or leader who might be concerned about, when we think about affirming care, what does that really mean? And there are things where we do believe the world is hijacking. Secularism is hijacking what is a true trauma responsive, but I would say gospel centered approach. And if we're not talking about it openly, then I think it does provide the room where things that should get into the church shouldn't be there. And so what is that? And so we do need to look at scripture as the source for then how we provide trauma-informed and trauma-responsive practices. It has to be what we go to, but we can't just sit on that and say, well, Jesus is the answer. Like we have to understand the impact that trauma has. And again, I think the Bible informs us, in all of this. And that is what we want to be able to start having those level of conversations here, at least in Lincoln. The good Lord will take it wherever it wants to go. But we believe here in Lincoln, these are very necessary and needed conversations. So,
and I think it's important to emphasize for the listeners, like, again, this isn't a one-off thing where if your pastor or you attend, you're gonna walk away with everything you need to know about trauma. It's like trauma doesn't work that way. Learning about it doesn't work that way. But again, this is a first step. We're going to have some really good church partners attend. We're also going to have some churches or people who really aren't associated with us or haven't partnered with us. And this is going to be an introduction for them to Christian heritage. And so don't think of it as the end all be all, but really the beginning of ongoing communication and partnership around the gospel and how we meet people where they're at in their pain and help and be an agent of healing and redemption.
And again,
in life.
Yeah. And when you look at some of our panelists already, I mean, it really is we want to take a really great look at what's happening outside the church, and we want to take a look at what's happening inside the church. And if there's resistance to doing that, like, I'm just going to say, you got to check your heart. If there's resistance to wanting to have these conversations, like, is your theology so frail that you can't feel like you can lean into these really tough conversations? Like, I get at some level you want to do this, but this is why these conversations are important, because then that way we can be informed. We have an opportunity to speak into it. That way we can hold each other accountable to making sure that straight and narrow path that we need to walk, which we need to walk, I think, on this topic, but we're doing it well so that, I think of the passage in John 3, obviously we all know John 3:16, for God so loved the world. But when you look at those passages right after that, it talks about, like, why are people afraid to come to the light? Well, it's because of fear and shame. At some level, our churches have to feel safe again. And I'll use the examples. The families that have said yes to taking kids into their home, they should never, ever have a church leader come to them and say, we are not the right church for you. We have completely missed that. If those are the conversations, or if a church is feeling inadequate in doing that, then do the work. Like, then what do we need to do to be that level of place for families? Because it is uncomfortable and it is messy. And I'm like, well, hopefully you've read the New Testament, because it is messy. Jesus, what he did was messy. What the first church did was messy. So I think it's those kinds of things. Like, if then we start, at some point we stop ceasing to being the church. So I think that's what what the summit is we want to lean into that together. And not make these declarations, because we long for healthy connections. We long for healthy community, in the sense that let's look at God's word together, and we're going to show you how desperate the situation is and what can we do together about that. And I think that's really getting to the heart of the summit.
That's good. So I want to double click on that. Something you said in particular, I can't remember the exact quote.
Okay.
but really it kind of got at like, is our theology so frail that we don't want to tackle this topic, right? I mean, let's do this. Let's kind of address some obstacles to maybe somebody who's like,
Sure.
Why should I come to this kind of thing? And maybe even not that. Maybe it's not even why should I come, but just why should I enter in to this topic, this issue, this massively complex issue? Why should I do that? I mean, and you mentioned it, kind of like our theology, you kind of alluded to it, like our theology can keep us from that. I think a big obstacle is when a lot of ministry leaders, church leaders hear the word trauma, they have a particular lens through which they see that. And that has led some Christians to kind of believe that, well, trauma is just an excuse for people to do whatever they want. And that's clearly not in line with the Bible. And so I really don't want to engage that world.
Right.
How would you, I kind of think I have a response, but I'm curious what you would say to that to help a pastor say, no, that's not right. Because that's not what we believe here at Christian Heritage. So that's not right. Here's maybe a different way to see it. And then why you should consider it still engaging despite that, quote unquote obstacle.
All right. So I'll get personal on this. And
I did not prep you for that. I did not.
You did not prep me, but you know me, I'm an open book. I haven't run this by my wife, so I will be very careful sharing my portion of this. But when I look at some of the things, when we think about this through my own home and my own relationship with my wife, I've got 3 kids, 17, one's turning 21 here soon and 25. So that's just kind of our life stage.
Yep.
There are significant church wounds that we both brought into our marriage.
Yep.
So much so that at one point my wife knew I had a very strong call on my life. Now, we always thought that was the pastorate. God has never opened that door for me. But we actually had a broken engagement because of her concern of being that pastor's wife and being involved in the messy relationships and woundedness of that
church. Yep.
That lens translates over to then how even Karen and I continue to talk about trauma, and we understand trauma because there are, I think there are certain, right. We form our belief systems from our wounds. We form belief systems on, all kinds of things we form our belief system on, right? Not just the good, but also what's hard, what's not so good. And so as a family, we walk through this on a regular basis in regards to what has happened to me, and how does that now inform me to the person I am today, and how does it inform my beliefs? So, right, James, my wife and I could be in the same car. We could be in a car accident together. We're both going to walk away from that car accident with a different experience, right? Yep. That's when we talk about trauma, that's what we're talking about. At some level, I can't say, well, you just need to shake it off, or you just need to let it go. My neck doesn't hurt, so your neck shouldn't hurt.
Yep.
I think that's kind of how we deal with trauma. Like, even though we had the same experience, we walk away with very different things.
Yep.
And so I think our understanding of trauma is an uncomfortable thing based on how each of us in our own experiences bring that lens into that.
Yep.
And it's not the same for all of us. And then we have a hard time resolving our personal experiences with who the person of Jesus is and what the gospel does in terms of being, once we accept Christ and we become a new creation, all of us have very different, kind of new life experiences in Christ. Some people who I know who struggled with certain things, no longer struggle with that. My dad is a great example of that. I would say addicted to alcohol, until he came to know Christ. He never touched it ever again. And I know others who struggle with alcohol, came to know Christ, and then still struggle with alcohol, right? So I think it's our personal experiences with the truth of the gospel that makes this so difficult to do. And then we start making assumptions then about other people's experiences. And because they're doing that, then it becomes even more a muddy water in regards to that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I say we live this out in our home on a daily basis. I have 3 kids. We're constantly living out what we do with wounds, what we do with sin.
That's good.
how does that translate into that? And then, and where does Jesus fit into all of this? And we can arrive at the right judgments or the wrong judgments, all of those kinds of things. So
no, I think that's a good start, and actually got at something that we talked about with Jeremy Smith in his interview is, trauma isn't the event itself. And it was in your example, right? The car accident is not the trauma. The trauma is really, how you respond to the event. The American Psychological Association defines it this way, right? An emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, natural disaster, something like that, right? And everybody experiences that differently. And there's so many things that go into it. Your chronological age, your emotional age and maturity, all the community that you have around you. Do you have connection? Do you not have connection? Are you physically healthy at the time? Are you not? Like, all that stuff goes into how I respond to an event. We had we had an event here in Nebraska a few months back with the tornadoes that wiped out homes. The people who had community around them, thankfully we live in Nebraska, so you have a lot of great community. That event is horrific, but the love that surrounded people helped them to grieve through that in a way that would have been easier than if they were alone and had no one. Right. And so then your response to that event changes because this one particular variable, and that's just one example. People who have cancer, right? They experience it differently when they're surrounded by great doctors, great family. They have insurance that can help, right? That allows them to experience their trauma differently. And so there's so many different variables. And what hurts me is when I hear a pastor, and you hear him on podcasts, you see it in articles, is, well, it's an excuse for people to behave however they want. And we just say, it's not sin. You didn't sin. And it's like, well, that's actually a different conversation. It's like, we're talking about vegetables here, and you're talking about stacking hay on a farm. Like, you're just in a different world. It's not even the same category.
Right.
And you see trauma throughout the scriptures, and we've talked about that in the podcast, but it's like a different universe. And what I don't want is for people to misunderstand what we mean when we talk about trauma.
Right. Well, and again, this is the point of the summit. The summit is to begin to create a shared language around making sure that we're talking about the right things. And there, again, what I hope is this is a rally. This is, something that births new things about how do we support those in our community better. I think every church longs for people to come to their church and, be discipled. And, we think about evangelistic efforts and all of that, but some of those efforts, again, aren't always constructive. It's sometimes, we miss it. There's a destructive nature to that. Yep. And part of that is we just want to do that well. We want to have the right conversations around that. And so we have to acknowledge that. And I know this is going to make some people really uncomfortable, but I want to encourage you, work through the uncomfortability of it. Be a part of the conversation, even sharing your opinion. Like, if you have strong opinions that go against what we share, like, bring it to the table. We'd like to understand more what the resistance is. So as we continue to want to reach more people in our communities, we know what some of those barriers are. Like, those can be very constructive. They don't have to be destructive.
You can't do anything
right. Go ahead.
We are very comfortable receiving critical feedback from church partners and pastors and ministers who are like, I don't see it that way. I don't agree. Like, that helps us, but also, like, and I know, Roy, you're this way, I'm this way too. Like, I'm really comfortable when somebody disagrees. Disagreement does not mean hate. It doesn't mean I don't like you or we're not on the same team, in terms of the kingdom of God team here. Like, we really welcome that. And we want you to know, like, bring your questions. We don't have all the answers.
Well, this is what's so fascinating about this. And this is a quick rabbit trail. When I think of how the church tackles interpersonal relationships, like, I just don't even know how churches do, on a grade scale of A to F, how well the church does on just communicating interpersonal relationships.
Mm.
But if you read the Apostle Paul, he's constantly addressing interpersonal relationships.
Always.
He's always informing us how to be towards each other, how to treat each other, whether that's the parent-child relationship or a marriage or just brothers and sisters in Christ. Like, why are you behaving these ways? But yet we rarely talk about it in the context of that. So you're right. So our definition of conflict, how we handle, all of those kinds of things then plays into our ability to have the right conversations. And that's a barrier to me, James.
And I want to say it also, what someone experiences, the trauma, it also impacts their personal relationships and how they interact. Right. So like, I'll give an example. So, low hanging fruit here. Let's say you're a minister, you're a pastor, you're listening to this and you're like, I'm dealing with a parishioner, a congregant, a member, whatever you call them. I'm dealing with somebody who does not trust authority. And I think that they're violating the biblical principle to trust biblical authority or church authority or leadership or whatever. Right. Okay. But let's say this person grew up with parents who abused them. They had a spouse who took advantage of them and left them. And they were in a church where they experienced religious abuse. How do you think they're going to respond to any kind of authority? Right. That affects their personal relationships. And so if you cannot be the one to be humble, kind, compassionate, listen, assume the best about people. I've been learning that my whole life, right? Assume the best about people.
We talk a lot about that around here.
A key for me, right? Like, so that particular individual's trauma, their emotional response to whatever events have happened in their life, it impacts their ability to cope, to heal, to grow, transform, whatever. And so as a minister of the gospel, you need to be aware of that. And I think like if we could really drill down into all those things, that the apostles write about in their letters, Paul in particular, I would like to know the backstory of what's going on. Right? And they knew the backstory. They didn't have to spell it out. Like the whole Paul and Barnabas breakup thing where they had this sharp, there's a backstory. We don't know everything, but they do.
Right.
And you have to assume there's relational discord because of something or things that have happened. It didn't happen in a vacuum. And we see it in 6 lines of text.
Right.
And then we preach a sermon on, we're like, fix it. It's like, it's not that simple. It's not that simple. That's why God just didn't give us the scriptures. He also gave us his spirit and wisdom, so we can work through those relational dynamics. But I love that. It's like relationships are hard. Let's lean in then, rather than just assuming, okay, I disagree, so we really can't work together. Right. Go ahead.
Well, and we're not talking about this in the right ways. And so when we look at what's happening nationally, some, big pastors, large pastors who have large influence, just saying that mental health isn't even a thing.
Yep.
You see what's happening in other large churches of the
cover-ups, failures, cover-ups,
sexual abuse, all of this. I mean, there's significant things going on.
Yep.
We have to talk about these things. We have to talk about them because for those that we long to reach for, I almost promise you that it's already validating their experience already with the church, and they're getting the wrong understanding of the Lord that we serve and who Christ is. And ultimately we are responsible for that. Like, we will be held accountable for people's understanding of who Jesus is by the way that I live out Jesus in my life daily. Yep. And again, this is that whole idea. If we long for children to flourish, our most vulnerable children and families, right? If we long for them to flourish, we have to flourish. At some level, I have to have a personal ownership of what true biblical flourishing looks like, and then how I live that out daily in my relationships with those that I do life with on a daily basis, but also the stranger I have yet to meet, the person I interact with as I'm driving, which is, I confess, is sometimes as an issue for me. But how I treat the waitress or the waiter, or like all of those kinds of things, like all of that has to flow out of a wholeness or shalom in regards to the person I am. That is what we are striving for. And so that is our personal responsibility to feel like, well, then we've got to start having some of the right conversations.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing.
It's tempting to think like, okay, this is like an addition to discipleship. I think we get into this rut of discipleship as I read my Bible, I pray, I attend church, maybe I go to a Bible study or a small group. But like, no, this is, I see this as like a kind of a undergirding of discipleship. I know people are familiar with like emotionally healthy spirituality. People have done that for Bible studies in a church. But to me, what we're talking about is a way to see. It's a paradigm. It's not a particular strategy or a tactic. It's not like, oh, this is in addition if I have time to my discipleship. It's no, this is how I see the world and how I see myself, how I see the people in our congregations, in my church,
Right.
in my small groups, in my neighborhood. I can see the world through new eyes because of Jesus's redemption, but because of the healing that he's done and he's still doing and he's still going to do in my own life, that I am able to confront my emotional responses to the events of my life. Right. And whether I got something or didn't get something, what I'm grieving, what I'm celebrating, like I'm entering into tough. And I'm telling you, this is like a white Midwesterner who comes from like Western European culture, right? Like right. This is, it's hard for me to enter in. But it's a way of seeing the world. And so it's not, and we've talked about this on the podcast, where we've had episodes on discipleship, but like how this is like the air you breathe. It's not like your discipleship's over here and then understanding trauma and human flourishing is over here. Like, no, it's integrated. Right. And if you have this, cerebral discipleship without the aspects of human flourishing and understanding trauma, it's like you actually have an empty discipleship. It's just incomplete.
Right. Well, it's like, again, if you think at some level the church is a 90-minute Sunday morning service, like you've completely missed the entire text of the Gospels of the Old and New Testament. Like that's what I think those are the kinds of things that, influence then what we believe about who we are and kind of our patterns. And I agree with you, James. I think we compartmentalize things way too much. And one of the best ways to gauge how well we are doing is you've got to look at the communities by which our churches are serving in. So I think of Jeremiah 29:7, but seek the welfare of the city where I sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare, you will find your welfare. So at some level, we can lament all we want about government and public school. Like there's a lot to lament about, by the way, but the church isn't done yet. We still have work to do.
Yep.
And, so that is the call. The call is we need to be seeking our city's welfare. And we have to look at the practices by which we are impeding that from happening. And we have to rethink these things. And some people are willing to do it. And I think some others aren't. And whatever's that holding you back, like do the work. I'm just like, do the work of what's resistance in you to embrace then what God is doing and might be doing.
So let's go there. I think,
okay.
We're building the plane as we're flying it here.
We are.
Probably in the next episode, which I know we're already going to have, I really want to get to some practical responses to some of these things we've talked about. But let's keep digging into like what holds us back, why we have so much ground to gain, why we minimize trauma in the church world. I want to keep going there, and I want to pick up on a couple things that some of our guest panelists talked about in their episodes. And then, it's kind of just a bridge from where you were going. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is something Jeremy mentioned. And kind of the quote was, understanding trauma requires you understand pain. And then he went into talking about how a lot of times we just use our religious practice, our religious ritual to just cover up pain or numb pain, or and I know in our notes, our private notes here, you mentioned kind of some Christian platitudes we use to just get over pain. But I find what he said so fascinating. Understanding trauma requires you understand pain. And he really alluded to, in the church, we don't always understand pain, maybe because we don't really like to. We don't really want to go there. So I'm curious what your response, because I know you listened to that. You weren't on the podcast and you listened to it. I'm curious what your response was when he said that's one of the reasons why we minimize trauma, is we don't understand pain. All right, Roy had to suddenly change locations. You were not crazy if you're watching this. We had some internet issues.
Yep.
Okay.
So I know where I left off.
We talked about understanding pain, and you said, I have a story. So why don't you start from there?
Okay. So again, the context is, Karen and I were leading a marriage thing back in Colorado Springs when I worked at Focus on the Family. We were covering grief and loss. And I think a couple's perspective is we're going to deal with the death of a loved one. Yep. It was so much more than that. And so when we talking about loss in general, we actually had couples get up and leave the class because they did not want to tackle whatever that was for them. And we actually had each couple sit down and write out what were some of those significant events for them, even before they were married, all the way through marriage. And we went through it. We talked about what grief is. There's what we talked about loss, the impact of that has on marriage. And I remember a week later, a couple that we had known at church came up to us, and she had shared that when they got home, her husband, I think they sat in their driveway for like 3 hours. She says, I learned so much in that 3 hours from my husband that I probably had in the previous, 20 plus years of marriage together. And so when we think about pain and what Jeremy is talking about, it really is, because of our experiences in life with pain and woundedness, like what Jeremy was sharing, I think was just absolutely dead on. Like, we can't even talk about trauma if we don't, at the end of the day, have a good understanding of pain, what the Bible has to say about pain, and what we do with that. And I thought Jeremy's, and your conversation with Jeremy was so insightful. Even as I have processed that myself, what do I do with my pain? I'll tell you, the pain from the things that I've experienced oftentimes will manifest itself in anger. It will manifest itself in such a way that people have to walk on eggshells around me, which I never want. Now, typically you'll never see that in the professional world, but you can ask my wife and my kids, how at times those things can not come out in such good ways. And you can't pray that stuff away, because I've tried. I've asked God for more grace, and he's obviously has always extended it. But there's just certain things about my makeup that at the end of the day, I have to deal with. I can't not acknowledge that, because my pain will manifest itself where I'm now creating pain for others. So I thought your conversation was just really dead on. And we just got to talk about that. And I think that, again, James, it goes back to our understanding of shared language. And so if the church can't even talk about that, we have problems if we can't talk about those things. We do. And I don't think we see it modeled in the Bible. I think it's our Western Americanized version of the church that I don't think is accurately reflective of what we see in the scriptures, what we're supposed to do with the story of Job. The fact that his friends, at the end of the day, probably still, in my opinion, gave some sound advice, but they weren't attuned to what the Lord wanted them to share and say to their friend. But they sat with his friend for 7 days and didn't say a thing. Like, for me, it's like, man, imagine teaching a class on that in our churches today. So I think it's just, those are the kinds of things we struggle with.
I'm going to share a story that everybody knows. Charlie Brown. Remember the beginning of Charlie Brown Christmas? And he's like, I'm depressed. It's like this. I don't even know how old they are, right? They're like 8.
Right.
How old are they? And is it who is it? Lucy? Lucy's the one that always takes the football out from under him, right? Lucy. She's like, she opens up her psychiatry office, and then they start to discuss, and then she says, you know what you need, Charlie Brown, is you need some religious activity in your life. You need something to do. You should be the director of the Christmas program. That's going to take away your depression, essentially.
Right.
So rather than kind of deal with your pain and whatever reason you're depressed, Charlie Brown, I'm going to give you a church activity to do. And you had sent me an article to read yesterday. We'll share it in the show notes. I thought it was really good. And they talked about, why the article was why the church doesn't want to talk about trauma. And in there, it was like, we have so much activity. We do so much religious activity. Right. And so then we really don't know how to understand and enter into our pain. And so then we really don't know how to help people heal and recover, because we are blitzed with just do this church discipleship program. You should lead the Christmas program. You should do ABC, XYZ. And those things aren't evil in themselves. That's part of the problem. They're not evil. If it was downright evil, we would see it from a mile away and go, oh no, Jesus doesn't want me to go there. But because they're actually really good things and they're fun.
Right.
And it brings smiles to faces and creates great memories, all that stuff. But ultimately those things, they may be neither here nor there when it comes to actually moving someone forward in life closer to Jesus. And so we just get blitzed with church activity. And so then we don't enter into the pain that we're dealing with.
Well, and I think, Trauma in the Pews by Janine, tackles that as well. Yep. In regards to Christian activity and it being, that was a really enlightening book for me, for someone who's been in Christian leadership, right? It's not like I've not been in significant roles or played significant roles. But all of that activity necessarily wasn't making me, me a better person. There was some not so good things. We talked about this when we got to know you and I got to know each other a little bit about my coming from Monadnock and where I was at 3.5 years ago. It wasn't because I was not working hard or not praying hard, but I was just a shell of a person.
Yep.
And so activity was not fulfilling that. And then I think at some level the very activity that God has even called us to or asked us to steward, which he's asked me to steward these things, is that ultimately he's like, but don't place your identity in those things either. That's not what defines you. And so again, you can't give what you don't have. I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying is, it is our way of trying to fix things. It's like, we just got to get them back involved in the game. Maybe I'm not saying that, they shouldn't get involved in good Christian activity to your point, but it's not the end all be all. But again, it's our inability to really talk about the uncomfortable things that no one wants to talk about.
Well, and I'm bent that way. I'm productive. I like to do things, even if when I'm at home, if there's pain, it's like, well, I'll clean up. I'll wash dishes. I'll go mow the grass. I'll work with my hands. I'll just do something. And eventually the thoughts, the feelings, they'll go away, right? So I medicate through doing and trying to be productive.
Which is a healthy thing.
Which is great. But it's a temporary stress relief. And then you go back and you're done. You finished mowing the grass or you finished building that thing you were doing or cleaning. And you're like, well, now I still have to address the thing that's going on inside of me, or the relational discord I had with my spouse, my children, whoever it is, even at work, right? Like you have to address those things. And so busyness is it can be good. It can be helpful. It can be a stress relief, but ultimately it's not going to help us to enter in.
Right.
I want to talk about one more thing here before we end. And then again, next episode, if you're listening, like we're really going to get into some practical things. And I actually think this will be a great lead in to some practical stuff for next time. In the interview I did with Tiffany, she's a social worker in Lincoln Public Schools, and also part of a private practice, a mental health. She's a mental health practitioner. And she talked about the harmful beliefs that she encounters in conversations with people. And you can go back to that episode to listen to a few of them. But one of the things that really comes up often, especially as I've heard from our Families Together team here, is And people just feel like I'm not worthy and I kind of deserve the lot I've been given. And God doesn't love me. God's not for me. And I would venture to bet we would never hear a church leader say that. But you hear it in other ways, right? In teachings, like, well, you take advantage of you should have taken advantage of the opportunities. You can work harder, right? We hear those things all the time.
Right.
Pray more. That's one. You mentioned that. Like, oh, have you prayed about it? Like, yeah. What do you think? I haven't prayed about it? Like, I've been praying about this for years, and it's not going away, and I still feel this way. And so, again, when you listen to that episode with Tiffany, what were some harmful beliefs that came to mind for you that really just can bombard Christians and keep us from entering in, or on the other side, from helping someone who's suffering? Did any come to mind?
Well, yeah, I mean, and I know we'll get into a lot more of, we've talked about just some of these platitudes that, we share, we see a lot of times in funerals, right?
Oh yeah.
We hear a lot of platitudes shared at funerals that, God just gained an angel, things like that. Yeah. But really where my thoughts went with Tiffany and your conversation with her was more kind of I'm kind of me, I'm kind of a very macro thinker. Yep. More belief, like what's some of those fundamental beliefs. It took me back to some of the things that I've experienced, my own life with the church. I've had things about the way people know me, know I'm pretty open, authentic, pretty vulnerable person about my experiences, what I think, my struggles, my doubts. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable at times. And I've had people question, whether I'm saved. Because, well, if you're filled with the Spirit and you're a new, it's those kinds of things that are extremely damaging, to be honest. Where I think, again, we've talked about this, where now that I understand is I'm actually looking for health and safe connections. There's got to be a level of felt safety that I have. And I realize at times, well, if I want others to feel safe, then I've got to be authentic. I've got to make others feel safe by me being vulnerable. Like it's a belief system I've gained through the fact that no one was doing that for me. And I think I've been able to work through that in a way that has made me more resilient and more gritty when it comes to the kind of person I am and feeling confident in that. But man, it's taken me a lot of years to get to that place where I have that level of to be emotional, to not be afraid of showing my emotions, which if you had seen me a long time ago, like I don't think I was that way.
Yeah.
So it's those kinds of things that I wrestled with in your, with the conversation with Tiffany, more of those kinds of specific things. I've had things about, I couldn't take on a position of church leadership because, I was not living a life above reproach, which most of the things that they heard was actually false and lies, which, so it's just, there's all of that kind of stuff that you have to navigate, in regards to then, what we do. And I'm really looking forward to our next one where we are actually going to get into a lot of those platitudes. I think those will be super practical and to be aware of like, oh my gosh, I say that, and how that's not the most helpful for those who you long to feel safe around you and for people to feel cared for and loved. But I think for me, it's a lot of those more larger, I don't know if I'm saying that the most accurate way, but it's more of those kinds of things. And based on my own experiences of, anyways, I don't know if that was super helpful.
That's good. I think for me as a former pastor and campus minister, something like a harmful belief. So this is not for, I have experienced ABC, XYZ, and now I have trauma in my life, in my mind and my body. This is what beliefs have kept me from helping people and entering in. And here's what it is. And I almost guarantee you, if you're a minister listening, you'll identify with this 100%. The particular theological school that I was really trained in, discipled in, and really grew up as an adult in was the belief of total depravity, which we would all agree, if defined properly, which we're not going to get into, is true. We're all sinful, right? Like we're all sinful. Now, I'm not going to get into the different, schools of thought and all that,
Sure.
but I had this belief of we're all so totally depraved that really anything we do is not good enough for God ever, which can keep me from entering into someone's pain, because I go back to what I said a few minutes ago is well, we all deserve wrath. And so really, if anything good happens in life, you should really just consider it a blessing, and that you're really lucky that God would smile upon you for those 3 seconds, because you're really trash. I've joked with you. I don't know if we said this on a podcast. One of my favorite memes out there is, it was like how church people comfort each other. And it was Woody from Toy Story 4 with Forky, and Forky, like Woody's down and he's sad. And Forky like puts his arm, his little pipe cleaner arm over Woody. And he's like, I'm trash, you're trash. And it's like that, if you know the movie, right? Yep. Forky, the whole movie is saying I'm trash. And really the whole movie is to show Forky, you're not trash. Like this kid loves you because of just you're you.
Right.
And she made you that way. And I think a lot of times, what I believed was, and because my theological heroes taught me, like, well, you're just trash. I'm like, but now I'm like, as I become an adult and I'm a parent, and I've actually ministered to people that had the experience, I realized like, man, like we're made in the image of God. Like I believed that too, but I didn't believe that as much as I believed that everybody was sinful.
That's good.
And what it did was it created pride and self-righteousness, and rather than humility. Because I think what that kind of a belief should create is humility, and that I have a need for God in my life. I can't save myself. Not to look at someone and go, well, you know what, you're really garbage. And I would not expect anything more from you. And that's why you're failing in this moment. But that's kind of what, I would have never said those words, but that's what can eke out in some of those ways. And we'll get to maybe some of those practical ways those come out of our mouth, and what actually to do instead next week. But that was, for me, that was a harmful belief that I had. It doesn't mean that I don't think we're still sinful. We are. Like, we need Jesus. But the way that it's framed and then the way it's communicated can be really detrimental when you're trying to serve someone and love them and have compassion on them.
No, I think that's really good, James. There's things I can absolutely relate, with that, where I feel like I can never measure up. I think that is part of the human existence, right? So there's levels of that, but again, I think how each of us works through, I think, the big questions of life. Who am I? What's my purpose? What gives my life significance, right? All of those things, then life can, again, our ability to deal with the pain, our ability to deal with the loss, it's the ability to deal with dreams that are lost, the aspirations that we have, right? All of those things, all of us at some level have experienced the impact of sin. And we see this in our field a ton, which is things that, most kids have not deserved what they've experienced in their life, right? So when you think about the abuse that we see, none of these kids have asked for that. None of them have asked, when you think about that parent-child relationship, and, most kids would feel like, well, I have a loving mother. Well, why do we think Mother's Day and Father's Day are like, oh, what are we going to do? Because we don't know how to acknowledge people's pain. We don't know how to acknowledge miscarriage. We don't know how to we don't know how to deal with those things. Yet people carry those burdens every single day, and they're trying to resolve, just like what you said. Well, how does my theology line up with, you say God is good, but then why did this happen? If God is so great, then why would, it's those kinds of things that at some level we do have answers for. It's not like the Bible's not void of answers, but it's the pathway to those answers where I think
Yeah.
oftentimes we short circuit, we sabotage because we get uncomfortable with the fact that we don't have all the answers. And I would just say, deal with it. You don't have all the answers,
Yep.
but we can point to the one who does, who can provide peace, who can provide comfort. That is our role
Yep.
in regards to that. And that's why we should be able to sit with our friend for 7 days, and be able just to be a presence and
Yep.
long for those healthy connections, which goes back to why this conversation, why the summit is so important.
Agree.
So those are the bridges that we have to build, James. Those are the connections that we've got to be able to begin to really talk about. If at the end of the day, we long for people to come to know the Lord, if we long for them to have not just so we can check a box and, hey, we've added to the family of God, like that should not be honest with you, that should not be our purpose. It's not our job anyways.
Yep.
Our job is simply to love God and to love others as ourselves. Yep. And I think this summit and what our conversations are is to help equip us to be able to do that really well.
Agree. Building bridges. And I hope you join us on that bridge so you can come September 17th. Head to the website. It'll be in the show notes on Facebook, YouTube, wherever you're watching or listening to this. It's $29 for the day. That includes lunch and the materials we give out. So we pray and we hope that it will benefit you, and we think it will. If you're not a minister and you want to come and bring your pastor. Bring your youth leader, bring your outreach, your care and compassion pastor, bring them. We would love to fill up City Impact. So that's September 17th. So we'll be back next week. We're going to get more practical next week. And then we'll see where it goes from there. But again, we'll be talking all summer about.
I'm really looking forward to the next one because I do feel like we're going to talk about some of those platitudes. And so just get really practical about, okay, so what does that really mean? Saying, right, God is good. God's good all the time. Like, well, he is, but when is the right time to be sharing that? So we'll get into that a little bit more.
Yeah, you won't want to miss it. So come back next week. We'll see you then. All right. It's been good to be with you, Roy. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I love it.